Okay, so we have kind of a big unit to go over today. It'd help if the clicker was on. Oh, hang on. I don't know why that didn't work. Okay, so we're doing chapters 17 and 18 this morning, and these chapters are a continuation of the second missionary journey. Let me shut this door. Hot like they're getting ready. And they're loud. So we started the second missionary journey last week, and chapter 16 is primarily him, Paul, in Philippi. And we read about the conversion of Lydia and the conversion of the jailer and so on. And now we're continuing that same journey. So this is all the same trip. In these chapters, he's going to visit 8 more cities before he eventually returns to Syria, which is where he's coming from. We'll also see that he's going to be met with a lot of animosity from the Jews. The Jews, this is kind of a running theme for the rest of the book. The Jews are going to be stirring up trouble against Paul. But we're also going to see new prominent partners in the gospel start to come up. He's going to meet Aquila and Priscilla. They're going to be important people. And then Apollos is also going to be really important. He'll come up at the end of chapter 18. This is the same map we looked at last week. I didn't put it in your notes this time because it's in your notes from last week on the last page. So he started here in Antioch, and he went through, and we left off with him here in Philippi. So he's went from here all the way through there, and today we're going to look at him going through the rest of this, eventually going back to Syria, to Caesarea, and then and actually we're going to read him starting the third missionary journey too, but we'll cover more on that next week. So this is the outline. This is what the headings are in your notes. We'll talk about Thessalonica and Berea first. Then he's going to go to Athens. That's kind of a big chunk. Then he's going to go to Corinth, and that's a big chunk also. And then he'll have a brief stop in Ephesus, and then he'll go back to Antioch eventually. Any questions? A couple of these places he writes to them, and these are books in our Bible. So like you have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, that's Thessalonica. That's the name of the place. Then Corinth, you have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He's writing to them. And then Ephesians is writing to the people at Ephesus. So these are connections he's going to start to make that we're still reaping the fruit of today because he wrote to them, and now those letters are in our Bibles. And this is him initially meeting these people. So first we're going to talk about Thessalonica and Berea. Thessalonica is a fun city to say. That's a fun name. So this is the beginning of chapter 17, still in the middle of the second journey. So he's left Philippi, and he eventually comes to Thessalonica. He went to a few other cities before that. He had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and then he comes to Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, there's a synagogue of the Jews there. Kind of interesting, he's really pretty far away from Jerusalem. He's pretty far away from Judea, but there's enough Jews in the area for them to have a synagogue. And this is going to be the case in all the other places he goes to also. And so now he's kind of as far as he'll go, and eventually he'll start backtracking. But for now he's in Thessalonica, and they have a synagogue of the Jews there. And that's important because it's the Jews that are going to stir up trouble against him. As was his custom, he went there first. This is what he does over and over and over again. He goes to a city, and if there's Jews in the city, if there's a synagogue, he'll go and meet them first, and he'll teach them. And then when they're resistant, that's when he teaches Gentiles. Right now, it's kind of both are included, but he'd always go to the synagogue of the Jews, and each Sabbath he would go in there. And that's what he does here. He would go each Sabbath, because that's when they would meet and read Scripture and things, and he'd go in it. He would reason with them in there. And this is what he does. When he was in there, he reasoned with them. And to reason with them, the word that's used, what that really means is to have sort of a dialogue with them, have a rational kind of conversation. The Greek word that's used is the word that we get our word dialogue from. So it's kind of a conversation. There's a dialogue that's happening here, and he's reasoning with them. And I like the word reason because it shows that what he's talking about is reasonable. There's things you can deduce from what he's saying. And what he's actually doing is he's using their scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, which is our Old Testament. He's using their scriptures, which they would have been very familiar with. They read it each Sabbath, and many of them had it memorized. He used their scriptures to prove that Jesus is the Christ. And you can prove from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ because he fulfills all of these prophecies that are in there. And so that's what Paul is doing. He's reasonable, he's rational, and he's proving to them that Jesus is the Christ using their own scripture. And the results that he had were kind of mixed. So it mentions that there were some Jews who believed, not all, but some Jews, and then there's also a great many devout Greeks and not a few leading women who had ended up believing. So there's a few Jews who believed, a lot of Greeks believed, those are Gentiles, and some of the leading women also believed. But the rest of the Jews, it says, were jealous. This is in verse 5. And this is kind of a lot of the motivation of the Jews is jealousy. That was a big part of why they did what they did to Jesus, is they were jealous of him. He also kind of posed a threat to their sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, to their establishment kind of a thing. And here they're jealous of Paul. I don't know what specifically they're jealous of, if it's the attention he's getting, if it's the message that he's preaching. I'm not sure what it is they're jealous of, but bottom line is they're jealous. And so they end up forming a mob, and they turned the city officials against them. Now, when you think of a mob, you probably just think of a crowd of angry people. But really, it's more than that, because a mob is a crowd of angry people who aren't really sure what they're mad about. They're just being mad for mad's sake. And that's kind of what is happening here. It's kind of like a few years ago, there was the mobs, there's like the riots that took place in the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter stuff. A lot of them didn't know what they were even fighting about. They were just out there destroying a bunch of stuff. That's what a mob is, and this is what the Jews form. And they end up turning the city officials against Paul. And so they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason. Jason apparently is the guy that they're staying with, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. When they couldn't find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who've turned the world upside down have come here also." And Jason received them, and they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there's another king who is Jesus. And so they twist what they're saying and turn the officials against them, because if you say there's a king besides Caesar, then you're going to have the Roman officials against you. And so they turn against him. They end up beating Jason. Jason ends up paying them off, and then that night they have to leave Thessalonica. They're not exactly driven out by the Jews, but the circumstances has led to them leaving. It's obviously not safe for them to be there, and so they end up going. So they leave Thessalonica, and then they come to Berea. Berea also had a Jewish synagogue. In fact, I think every other place that Paul's going to go to has, besides Athens. Athens might even have one. Yeah, they have one. So every other place he's going to go to on this trip has a Jewish synagogue there. A synagogue is kind of like their church building, you could say. Synagogue literally means like gathering place. So this is where the Jews would meet at. And Berea also had one of these. And so it's kind of funny, after what has just happened by the Jews in Thessalonica, you'd think they might be a little more hesitant to keep going to the synagogues, but they don't care. They just go right back in, even after they've more or less been driven out of Thessalonica. And what we see, the Jews in Thessalonica were jealous, and so they stirred up a mob. But the Jews in Berea were more noble than those other Jews. They're sincere. It says that they received the word with all eagerness. If someone is sincere, if they're actually looking for the truth, then this is what they'll do. They'll receive the word with eagerness, with all eagerness. A lot of times people, they have walls built up around them, and so sometimes they're hesitant to, receive the word. Maybe they believe a certain thing and it doesn't line up with what the Bible teaches or whatever. But these people are sincere and they receive the word with all eagerness. And it also says that they examined the scriptures to see if what Paul was saying was right. And as it turns out, he was right. And so a lot of them became believers. And the people of Berea, you might hear the people of Berea used sometimes as like an analogy, the Berean Jews trying to be people like the Berean Jews because they're sincere and they would look at the scriptures to see if what was being taught was right. And that's kind of a model for how we ought to do things. And so there's a lot of Jews in Berea that are becoming Christians. And the Jews in Thessalonica get wind of this and they don't like it. And specifically what it says is the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also. So they don't like that the word of God is being proclaimed. And so they come to Berea from Thessalonica, and as they did before, they stirred up the crowds against Paul. And this leads to kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of a rash thing that they end up doing. They end up just sending Paul away to the sea. They say, hey, get in this boat and get out of here. Silas and Timothy, who were with him, they stayed behind, but they send Paul away. And so he gets in a boat, he's sailing, and he eventually arrives at Athens. So that takes us to the next section. Any comments or questions? Athens is still a real place. You know what country Athens is in?
Wait.
Greece. Athens is in Greece. So now he's in Athens. He sailed there from Berea. And now that he's in Athens, he's looking around. And it says, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. And so there's all this idolatry that's going on there. There's these people that are worshiping these other gods, these man-made gods, these carved images of gods. That's what idolatry is. And this provokes him. He gets upset at this. He once again goes to the Jewish synagogue. And I almost wonder if he was maybe trying to see with the Jewish synagogue there, what's the deal with all this idolatry? Why aren't you doing something about this? Because it's one thing if you're worshiping God but you're a Jew. It's another thing to worship these other things that they were worshiping. And that's what they were doing. And the Jews, I don't know if they didn't care or if there wasn't much they could do about it or whatever. He goes to the synagogue. It also says that he would reason with people in the marketplace. So now it's a little different. He's not just going to the Jews, but he's in the marketplace. And so now he's in a public sort of a setting where anyone could have been there because everyone had to go to the marketplace if you wanted to buy food. And so he's in the marketplace. He's reasoning with people there. And this gets the attention of the philosophers. One thing about Athens at this time, you'll sometimes hear names of different philosophers from way back when. You'll hear names like Socrates or what are some other ones? Plato, people like that. These are Greek philosophers from even before this time, a few centuries before. At this, someone who thinks about like logic. And so it's kind of nonsensical stuff. that they think about. They were kind of debating just for the sake of debating, so there wasn't really any good purpose behind it. And so these are the philosophers that would engage in these discussions just for discussion's sake. And this is what they did in their spare time. This was their hobby. And they thought of themselves as being wiser than the rest of the world. And their influence would rub off on some people. Like Corinth is just a little bit south of Athens. And so the Corinthians had a little bit of this with them too. Paul addresses some of that in the book of 1 Corinthians. But so now this gets the attention of the philosophers. You can kind of see what they're about because they liked to hear new things. Oh, there's this new idea. Well, let's hear about it. Let's discuss it. And so they asked Paul, teach us this new teaching. And so what it says is some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he's preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting. So they want to hear what he has to say. You would think that they'd be sincere, but really I don't think they are, because they're looking maybe for something to add to what they already were doing. And so this audience was a bit of a new breed for Paul. These are intellectual people. These are people who were always trying to get smarter just for the sake of being smart, not really for any sort of skill or any sort of use for it. They just wanted to let people know that they're the smartest people in the room. And one thing to point out is that they're religious, but they're pagan. And what that means is that they would worship anything and everything. It didn't have to be... They would worship, a carved image. They would worship a pole. They could worship anything. And so they're pagan people. But they are religious. Pagan people are somewhat religious. They're not non-religious like what you see a lot of today. People will say, well, I'm not religious. They're atheistic or agnostic or whatever. That didn't really exist back then. They always believed in something. And we saw before that Athens had a lot of idolatry in it. And so they're pagan people. One thing about them is they were pluralistic, and what that means is they believed in more than one God. They believed in a lot of different gods. I don't know if you've studied this in school, but there's like the Greek mythology stuff. There's like Zeus and all the other ones. They believed in a lot of different gods. And if Paul came in and said, well, Jehovah or, Jesus is the Lord, they'd say, okay, we'll add Jesus to our other gods that we already worship. So they're pluralistic. And in fact, they believed in what they called the unknown God. And what this was about is when a good thing would happen, they would thank the gods that they worshipped, but they didn't know if they're leaving out a god or not. Maybe it was the God of Jerusalem that did this. Maybe it was the God of, wherever. And so to cover their bases, if there's a God they didn't know that did something, then they would thank this unknown God. And so that just shows you how pluralistic and how pagan they are. They say, well, maybe we didn't thank all of them, so we're just going to thank this unknown one to try to cover our bases. And so Paul is going to speak to them. He's going to give a message to them. And one thing that's interesting with this message, this sermon that he gives is used as an example a lot of times for how you ought to preach if you go to like different cultures. Like if you go on a mission trip, say to Africa or something, how to maybe try to reach people there. He caters his message to the Athenian people. He doesn't change any of the substance of it, but he caters it to them in a way that they can understand it. So one thing he does is he points out that they're very religious. He says that in verse 22. He says, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. And so he starts by giving them their flowers, so to speak. He points out that they are religious. That's a starting point, but obviously there's more that needs to be done. He then points out their unknown God, and he directs them to the Lord of heaven and earth. The things that they would thank the unknown God for? He tells them that's actually the Lord of heaven and earth that's doing this for you. So he says, this is in verse 23 and 24, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind, and so on and so forth. So he takes what they called the unknown God, and he attributes that to the Lord of heaven and earth. He then also quotes their own poets, and he attributes what they're saying to God. This is in verse 27 and 28. He says, he quotes one poet, he says, in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Then he talks about being God's offspring in verses 29 and following. And he uses that to his advantage for his message. And so he's able to quote their own poets and talk about God with it. And then finally, you can tell the substance of his message doesn't change because he brings it to the resurrection. The resurrection is kind of the main point, is that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And what he points out here about the resurrection is that it's the sign that Jesus was who he said he was, and that God did what he said he would do. And this God is the one, not any of these other ones. So he gives them this message about the Lord of heaven and earth. He uses some of their own cultural things to try to persuade them. And that's just masterful stuff that he does. And the results, again, are sort of mixed. In particular, there's mixed feelings about the resurrection. Some people flat out mocked him for talking about a resurrection. But there are others who wanted to hear more about it. And then there are still others who actually became Christians because of that. So it says, this is verse 32, now when they heard of the resurrection, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. And then it mentions verse 34, but some men joined him and believed, among who are Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, or Damaris, and others who are with him. So some people mocked him because he talked about the resurrection. Others wanted to hear more, and some ended up believing. The reason that some of them mocked him is because many of them were naturalists. And what that means is if you're a naturalist, you only believe in what you can see. You don't believe in supernatural things. You don't believe in miraculous things. And so there's a lot of naturalists in the world today. And so they don't believe in miraculous things. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in angels or demons. They don't believe in any of that. They only believe in what they can see. And the Greeks were like this. They didn't believe in a lot of these supernatural things like a resurrection. And this way of thinking was highly influential for the area. The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection because the Greeks didn't believe in it, because these Athenians didn't believe in a resurrection, because that's supernatural. And so they didn't believe in it, and that influence infiltrated all these different places of the world, and that influence is still around even today. Next, he's going to go to Corinth, but before that, you have any comments or questions? All right. So next he goes to Corinth, from Athens to Corinth. It wasn't that far away, same area. And in Corinth, he meets a couple who's been expelled from Rome, and that couple is Aquila and Priscilla. So now we're into chapter 18, and Aquila was a Jew. He was a native of Pontus, and they had come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And this was a real thing that happened. You can look up the history, and this is something that happened. There was a fire that happened in Rome, and it was a really devastating and destructive fire. It burned down a bunch of their stuff. And it was really the emperor's fault, Claudius, but he ended up blaming the Jews for it. And so the Jews got expelled out of Rome. And so Aquila and Priscilla were among those who got expelled from Rome, just because the Jews were kind of a scapegoat in that moment. So Paul befriends them. He meets this couple, and these people are going to end up being pretty important people. And Paul ends up staying with them in Corinth for a time because they worked in the same trade. They were tent makers, someone who made tents back then. And what this shows us is that Paul actually had a job. He had a career. And so he was a Pharisee before. That would have been his career. But now, as he's kind of traveling along, because he would have had to have been dependent on people to support him, and so he would make tents to try to get by, to try to make a living. And once again, he comes to a place, there's a Jewish synagogue there. He would go in the synagogue each Sabbath and he'd reason with them, and this happens for a long time. And so now Silas and Timothy catch up to him. He had left them behind in Berea, which was in Macedonia. Now he's in Corinth, which is in Achaia, and so they catch up to him. And it says that when they arrive, he was occupied with the word. I really like that expression. He's occupied with the word. And what is happening is he's in a heated dispute with the Jews. And so it says that he's testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And then it says, when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. So he shook his garment against them, which is kind of a way of showing that you're upset. And he ends up leaving the Jews, and he says he's now going to go to the Gentiles. And so this is a story that we've seen before. The Jews aren't responsive, so he says, fine, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And what's funny is he leaves the synagogue, but it actually says that he was staying with a guy named Titius Justus, whose house was next door to the synagogue. So even though he's not going to go in the synagogue anymore, he's staying in a house next door to the synagogue, and he actually ends up converting Crispus, who was the ruler of the synagogue. So this is a pretty prominent conversion. This is a high figure kind of a person, Crispus being the ruler of the synagogue. This is a big deal to convert Crispus.
Crispus?
That was his name. Greek name. So he converts Crispus, who's the ruler of the synagogue. And from this moment on, a lot of things that Paul does in Corinth start to go right. His visit in Corinth overall goes pretty well. It says that many of the Corinthians believed and were baptized. It says that in verse 8, many of the Corinthians hearing Paul believed and were baptized. So he's able to make a lot of disciples while he's in Corinth. There's also this cool story where he has this vision and the Lord speaks to him. And because you got to keep in mind, Paul has been met with a lot of animosity as he's been traveling. And we read before about how he was stoned at Lystra. And so he's had a lot of physical persecution. He's been put in prison. A lot of stuff has happened to him. But the Lord says to him, don't be afraid, but go on speaking, and don't be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. And so he has the Lord's protection. And with that in mind, Paul ends up staying in Corinth for 1 year and 6 months. As far as we know, at this point, this is the longest he has stayed in one place, is 1.5 years. Eventually, though, things start to go south. The Jews rallied up an attack against the brethren, not Paul specifically, but against some of the Christians there. And eventually it just gets time for him to leave. And so Paul ends up leaving Corinth, and he's starting to head back to Syria, back home. Questions, comments? Now he's going to make a brief stop in Ephesus, and he'll eventually return to Antioch. So he stops really briefly in Ephesus. And what he does while he's there, one thing he does is he drops off Aquila and Priscilla. One thing that as Paul begins to make connections that he's going to be able to do is he's going to say, okay, I'm going to leave these people here. He leaves Aquila and Priscilla there. We know later on, because he will eventually go back to Ephesus, and we know that at one point he leaves Timothy in Ephesus. When he writes the book of 1 Timothy, he talks about leaving him there in Ephesus to put elders in and so on. So he leaves Timothy there. He's going to leave Titus in Crete eventually, which is another place. And so as he begins to make these connections, he's able to kind of leave people there so that he can go and do other things. And so he drops off Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. They're going to stay in Ephesus for a while. And then once again, there's a synagogue there. So he goes in and he's reasoning with them. This is a really interesting thing that happens, because they want him to stay, but he's not going to stay. He's going to end up leaving. But he says to them, if God wills, then I'll return. And he will return. In fact, that's going to be the start of the third missionary journey, which we'll look at in the next chapter. But for now, he just stays for a short time and he leaves. And he returns to Syria, which is the province that he started in. These provinces, you can kind of think of them like states in America. They're different states and they have different cities in them. Syria is like a state of Rome. And Syria had Caesarea in it, and it also has Antioch in it. Antioch's where he started at. He's going to go to Caesarea first, and then he'll go back to Antioch. And then almost as soon as he gets back, he's going to leave again. And this is the start of his third missionary journey, which we'll talk more about next week. So it says, he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So that's the start of the third missionary journey. He starts by going through Galatia and Phrygia. Each of those is like a state. There's a letter to the Galatian people. Galatia is just a big area with different cities in it. That's why in the book of Galatians, he'll say to the churches, plural, of Galatia. It's to different cities and things. So this is the start of the third missionary journey. And now for a brief moment, the story shifts off of Paul. And we see another person emerge, and that person is Apollos. Apollos is a pretty important person. It says that he was an eloquent man, meaning he spoke well. He was a good speaker. And it also says that he was competent in the scriptures. That's a recipe for some good things to happen. Because sometimes you can have someone who's a good speaker, but they don't know what they're talking about. And then other times you could have someone who's competent, but they don't speak well in front of people. Apollos is one of the rare people who can do both really well. He's a good speaker, and he's competent in the scriptures. It mentions about him that he's a native of Alexandria. He had come to Ephesus. He's an eloquent man. He's competent in the scriptures. And he's been instructed in the way of the Lord. So he knew Jesus. He was a Christian. And he spoke and taught the things accurately about Jesus, except for one thing, and it's the end, which is baptism. He only knew of John's baptism. And one thing that comes from this is it shows us that there's a difference between the baptism that John did. This is John the Baptist in the early part of the Gospels. There's a difference between that baptism and the baptism which is now, which is the baptism into Jesus for the forgiveness of sins. They're different. John's baptism was unto repentance. The baptism that exists now is for the forgiveness of sins. So there is a difference. He only knew of John's baptism. So he had like 95% of things right, but there's this one part that he didn't quite know. Aquila and Priscilla, who were there in Ephesus, Paul left them there, they end up correcting him. They say, hey, no, this isn't right. You need to fix that. And he ends up leaving with their blessing, and he goes to Achaia. And so he goes now where Paul just came from. He goes to where Corinth is and where Athens is. And we're going to read, well, we won't read it, but you can read it in the book of 1 Corinthians. Apollos, because he leaves there and he goes to Achaia, which is where Corinth is. Apollos was a pretty influential person to the Corinthian church. And that's one thing you read of in the earlier chapters of 1 Corinthians. So, that's the end of the second missionary journey, and here are some of the key takeaways from it. Kind of the big takeaway that I have is Paul is frequently met with animosity from the Jews during this journey. You can go back to when he was in Philippi. There was some animosity there. They end up putting him in prison. That wasn't necessarily from the Jews, but there's animosity there. And then all these other places he goes, there's all this animosity from these Jews. They're jealous. They don't like what he's teaching, and so they try to hurt him. They try to harm him. They eventually will try to kill him even. Despite all of that animosity, he kept going to them first in each city. And the reason why I think that is because Jewish people, they had a little more religious background. They knew their Bible. And so in a lot of ways it's easier to convert them, but in a lot of ways it's also harder because they're so stubborn. And so he would go to them first in each city. He never let that persecution get him down. He would always, when he would get knocked down, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, he'd get back up and he'd go on to the next. And so the persecution didn't get him down. And now we see that the gospel has reached the European continent. This is modern-day Greece, is where Paul is going to now. Athens, that city still exists today, Athens, Greece. You can go there and you can see a lot of some of the ruins from this time period. Corinth, also in modern-day Greece. I don't know if Corinth exists today or not. If it does, it's not the same. But he goes to a lot of these different cities, and this is a totally different continent. And so now he's going from the Middle East to Europe. And so the gospel is being taken to the ends of the earth, and that's a really neat thing. Next week, we're going to look at Acts chapter 19. This is will be the beginning of the third missionary journey. Chapter 19, he's in Ephesus the whole time. Any questions or comments?